Welcome back to another episode of the Zealous Podcast. This week, I am honored to have as a guest Lee Burton. And Lee is one of the co-creators, co-founder of the Functional Movement Systems. He and Gray Cook, his partner in crime, developed the Functional Movement Screen back in the 90s, and it has gone through a whole bunch of development and growth. And, well, we're going to sit down and have a chat with him because he is one of this week's speakers on Perform Better's Meeting of the Minds. Hope you enjoy it.
Rocky, thank you so much for having me on today. Really excited about talking to you and just kind of kicking things around and changing some ideas here.
Yeah. Now, another little tidbit I found out just now was that you and Gray, you guys grew up in the same hometown.
Yeah, we did. We grew up in a small town, and actually that's where our offices are today. A small town called Chatham, Virginia. Gray his dad was our minister at a small little church in this area, and Gray's a preacher's kid, so he's got all the little things to do with. But yeah, his families and my families, we grew up together, and he's a little older, so we didn't hang out because I was that little kid that when you're older at that age coming up, you don't hang out with the little kids. But yeah, it was I guess the stars aligned that I was coming out of graduate school and he was moving back to open up a clinic, and he saw my dad of all things and said, hey, my dad's certainly trying to get me off his payroll at the time. And Gray and I talked and we hit it off, and yeah, we've been together ever since. And that was 1996 actually. So it's been 25 years this year.
That's
it. Crazy.
Yeah. Same year I opened up my doors here. So congratulations on your anniversary. I definitely know how that feels. But I want to go back to Appalachian State University, because I remember going to the early conference of the NSCA. The CSCS certification had begun in '85. So it wasn't like there were a lot of us around in less than 10 years time there. So you got to know quite a few. And I got to tell you, Professor Stone was a pivotal part in my direction when I was coming from like the bodybuilding typical background and started to explore the functional nature of movement. I mean, he was a monument standing in the field. So I must imagine that's probably how it was with you.
Yeah, I mean, at the time, I'm early '90s. I started my undergrad degree at Appalachian State in 1990, and got out in '94. And that's right when they were doing, their books, and they were emerging as really the experts in periodization. And of course, as a college student, you don't appreciate it at the time, and I didn't. I was just struggling to get through O'Brien's kinesiology class and Dr. Stone's courses, because my major was athletic training, so I wasn't immersed in strength conditioning. And so I was taking those courses as part of my major, and at the time didn't really know it. But once I got out, and actually the one thing when Gray hired me to work at the clinic, the one thing he made all the people who worked with the patients, because Gray's a physical therapist, and he wanted everyone, no matter what your background is, to get your strength and conditioning certification. So he pushed me to get my strength and conditioning certification. And when I started studying for it, of course, like you said, Rocky, you start seeing the same names kind of pop up with what the things you got to learn. I'm like, man, these guys taught me when I was an undergrad. So it was pretty neat when I started studying for my CSCS to see that a lot of what people I was engaged with at the time were really the experts in the field.
Wow. Very cool. Yeah. I got to say, I'm probably in the same camp with you. I was appreciating it to some degree, but I'm sure you'll say the same thing. When you begin to go down this path of education and knowledge, and you began to explore and understand more and more, you realize that there was such incredible information right at your feet, right at your doorstep, and just wishing that you had a little bit more time to appreciate that. So, the functional movement screen started, just say 97, 98, somewhere around there.
Yeah, that's about right. Yeah, I mean, we started tinkering around with the idea, and the late probably 1996, 97. Gray came back and kind of gave this idea to us, and it was never the thought that we were going to be, teaching seminars or doing anything more. Again, this is 1990s, mid to late 1990s. I mean, nothing was, like you said, you get to a conference, that was really where you start to get to know people. There's no social media, there was no podcast. So really where you learn stuff was going out and engaging with other people. So, we really were just trying to come up with some different ideas on how we can improve the pre-participation physical, and try to just identify athletes who really weren't ready to go in the weight room and lift heavy weight. And that's really what started it. And then from there, it just kind of blossomed from that point.
Yeah, because at the time,
it was probably 96, 97. It took us about a year and a half to figure the whole thing out.
Well, the standard fitness assessments at that time was like a sit and reach, a maximal bench press, a leg press, the skin fold calipers, and maybe a cycle ergometer for aerobic capacity. It wasn't giving us an understanding of the quality of the individual in regards to movement. So here comes this screening process, and I think when I stumbled on it, there were 10 or 12 screens, which got whittled down to about 7 over the course of a few years later. But there was the seated rotary torso. I think that was taken out a little bit later, and a couple others. But then drove into the Y balance testing. And, that was a wonderful rabbit hole to start to pursue. And it opened up a lot of eyes for everyone in the industry, but it wasn't meant to do that. That's the thing that I keep smiling and kicking back and just kind of giggling in the corner going, these guys, they developed something that they had no idea what it was going to turn into. And was there a time where you wanted to pull the reins and stop the wagon train and go, whoa, wait a minute, guys, this is not what this is about?
Yes. I mean, there was definitely, it was, early on, like I said, our goal was to try to get it out to street coaches and athletic trainers at a high school. So they could, and it wasn't even, when I say get it out, it wasn't like we were trying to create a seminar. We weren't, but we were going and getting advice from West Virginia University was a big place we went, and Virginia Tech, the two places we went early on, and just to interact and say, hey, here's something we're kicking around and we're doing, because we had connections there, and just, hey, does it work? Does it not work? Give us some feedback on it. And that's what allowed us to continue to mold it. And then quite honestly, we were working with Reebok at the time, of all things, Reebok University. And we had the opportunity, because Reebok University, it's just the timing, and looking back now, it's just interesting. Reebok University, or Reebok, had actually signed a big NFL contract to be all the NFL apparel. Well, one of the things they wanted to do was Reebok University was basically an education company for personal trainers, step aerobics, that was all really Reebok University back in the day. Well, long story short, they wanted to provide some education to the strength conditioning coaches as a way of kind of, hey, we're doing this apparel, we'd like to provide some education. And so they approached us, they heard Gray speak, and they approached us about doing it. And Gray, thinking out of the box, and again, this is the timing of this, nobody was thinking like you just said. This was just totally different way of looking at things. And now it's not. Now you look at it's a movement screen, or there's hundreds of movement screens out there now, which that's fine. But at the time, there's nothing like that out there now, or like that then. So we had an opportunity to go and present in front of a lot of NFL teams, pretty much all the NFL teams at the time, and NHL teams, and talk to them. And it wasn't for us so much about driving home that you got to do this movement screen. It was more or less just trying to, and I think you just kind of alluded to, Rocky, kind of thought provoking. Hey, we need to be thinking a little bit differently. Here's a tool that we have found based off our few years at the time of work. And, we don't have any research. We don't have any other thing other than this internally, what we've been doing, the feedback we got from a handful of universities. Hey, you guys, here's something you be thinking about. And here's some, when you identify some problems, here's some things you should be thinking. And, it really took off from that point. And like you said, we didn't have a chance, in my opinion. It's kind of good and bad. We didn't have a chance to really do some of the things that, looking back, would have been nice to do. And it really related to research, validation. Once it kind of got out there and people started gravitating to it, people started literally emailing and calling and saying, hey, can you come in and teach a seminar for me? Or can you come in and do an in-service? One of the things we did, I would say back probably in 2006, 2007, is did some biomechanical analysis, which if you know the movement screen, we cut it down. We have a 0 to 3 scoring system. And one of the things, and we never published this, but it let us know that, okay, we're doing something right, is it validated the scoring system. And to this day, I don't even talk about it. It's probably the first time I talked about it in 15 years. Is it let us know that all of our tests, the cut points we made were right. Like when you do a 1 on the squat, this is what it means. And we did the biomechanical analysis to kind of tell us, all right, you guys are on the right track. And it was never our intention to necessarily publish it, because it was more for Gray and I to say, all right, it validated us internally. We're doing something right. Now let's keep down the road. Or we would have probably pivoted at that point. But looking back, Rocky, to answer your question, it probably would have been smarter to basically publish that and go through that process, because I would have had to answer a lot less questions to this point.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned Reebok, and I still actually have a Reebok trainer here, one of those platforms. And and I use it with the surfers, because in Santa Cruz, that's a large population that come through here. And it is one of the best balance kind of platforms where I can get them to rotate and torque, and they can really work on speed without being so far into the balance realm. They can actually stay in their central place and start to move it. So I've held on to that. It started out as one tool and turned into something completely else, which I guess is FMS in itself, because then you guys, not to do the whole kind of biography of FMS, but there was a time where there was the selective functional movement assessment, the SFMA, which correct me if I'm wrong, but it was only relegated to those that were physical therapists. It wasn't for the gym rats like myself to delve into, which for me, personally speaking, was a gift, because if I'm told I can't get something, then I'm going to walk around the building until I find a door that's open. So I started to explore posture alignment and gait patterning and foot mobility and all those things. And wouldn't you know it, it was a lot of the stuff that you guys were doing, but I had to go around a different way. Now, of course, it sounds like it's open to quite a few people who ever want to do it. But I love the fact that anytime we talk about whatever business or widget, you get an idea, and if there's truth to it, if there's heart and passion, it can erupt into such amazing goodness for so many people. So, hats off to you and Gray for getting that going. But I want to kind of change directions now, because you and I both, I guess I'm kind of the rookie in the Perform Better family these days. This will be my second year and being with you guys as presenters. But for, I would say 15 or 16 years, I was out in the audience listening to you speak at every event in Long Beach that I could get my hands on. But you've got the Meeting of the Minds coming up this coming Thursday. And a few of the people that I've already had on Zealous, like Michelle Dalcor, Sue Falzoni, they're going to be with you, as well as somebody that I haven't had on, which is Frank Dolan. But the four of you are going to be discussing mobility and stability, and just giving maybe a listening audience a little preview. What is it? I don't mean what is mobility and what's stability, but what is your take, and where do you see this going?
Yeah, when we talk about this idea, and really what I think has become mainstream, is this movement idea of focusing on movement, right? I mean, we came up with the movement screen, functional movement screen, back in the mid '90s, and back then, Rocky, it was about functional training, right? I mean,
Sure.
You had Gary Gray and you had Vern Gambetta, who was really talking about functional training. We got to get away from isolated training. We got to move to functional training. And then we, developed the functional movement screen. And then, over the last, say, 10 years, movement has been this big, in my opinion, good thing, talking about movement and primal movement and everything like that. Well, if you think about movement's, in order to move well, you've got to have two things, and that's mobility and stability. And when you say mobility, most people think, well, flexibility. When flexibility is part of it, but mobility is really your joint, your body's ability to move, and your joint's ability to have freedom of motion. And that's in the joint, the area. And in order to have freedom of motion, you have to have flexibility. So that's mobility. Now, stability is really your body's ability to control that motion. So in order to have good movement, you've got to have a kind of a yin and yang of mobility and stability. So, I think there's always some discussion. And again, that's why we're having the discussion next week to Perform Better is, mobility and stability. And at the end of the day, you got to have both. Some people, and I think where we come from, kind of our philosophy is, well, we're going to do some screening and we're going to identify a movement problem, because ultimately your brain doesn't really think about flexibility or mobility or stability. Your brain works in patterns. That's why isolated training is good if you're a bodybuilder, and good if you want to look good. I mean, my son right now is 15, is doing bicep curls and stuff because he wants to have big biceps. Okay, that's fine. I'm not gonna argue with him on that. But if you want to be able to bend over to pick up an object, twist around and do stuff, that's how your brain operates. Your brain doesn't say, okay, I've got to make sure I contract my bicep to do this. Your brain says, hey, I got to pick up this fork. In order to do that, I've got to have elbow flexion, elbow extension. I've got our pronate, supinate, abduct, adduct, and that's a pattern that your brain understands. And that's what the brain knows, and that's movement, and that's function. In order to feed yourself, you've got to get through all these little pieces, and that's really what Gray and I look at as software that's filed away in your brain that we learn when we're really, really young. We learn all that when we're young, and that's movement, but it's all based off having good mobility and good stability.
Yeah, I also think along the lines of strategy and negotiation. Like, you have a strategy to do something, and then every articulation is going to have to negotiate a certain timing, a certain movement. And then if that is the most efficient means of doing it, it becomes a pattern, at least in the moment. So whether it starts at youth, but then an experience occurs, whether it's an injury or a surgery or an emotional episode or something that now triggers a change in physical behavior, then we're starting to talk about, now that has to negotiate on top of the previous one. So now we're getting negotiation upon negotiation. So really, when we think about mobility, stability, every articulation is meant to move to a certain degree. Some of the bigger ones, of course, are going to hold on to a great percentage of the movement, while the smallest ones still have somewhere or something to contribute. So it would sound like, it's great, that whole stacking of mobility, stability, that story about Mike and Gray being in the bar talking about the opposing actions. But at the same time, they both take on, the knee takes on the role of mobility and stability. Gary Gray, who you mentioned earlier, he kind of did the tweaking of a term and calls it most stability, where they're both occurring at the same time. So how do you recognize that? I mean, what strategy, what type of eyes must somebody have, really? And not necessarily the approach so much as, if you were trying to teach a movement specialist what to look for, do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think you're spot on with what you said right there, Rocky. It is a behavior, and at the end of the day, you're going to react and respond in order to accomplish the task. Whether the task is throwing a ball, or whether the task is, like I said, picking up a fork and feeding yourself. That's just a task that you're ultimately going to learn to do. Now, as you also said, based off of whatever life throws at you, whether it's an injury, whether it's you're stressed out, or whether you've overtrained yesterday, or like you said, you've been out surfing, so you're worn out. Your body's going to change and do what it needs to do to continue to perform a task like feed yourself. And I think that's the reason when we talk about mobility and stability, you can't separate the two. Those are, like you said, the knee has to have a requisite amount of mobility, but it's got to have a requisite amount of stabilization. There's certain joints that are more prone to be more mobile than stable. But at the end of the day, they both have to have that combination. But to answer your question, I think too often people try to be pinpoint and be too specific. And that's why we always say you need to look at a pattern. It's like the whole is better than the sum of its parts. And for example, if I can bend over and touch my toes, then I know I've got enough hamstring flexibility to do what I need to do. Now, if I split my feet out and now I can't do something, maybe like touch my toes, something as simple as that. So feet together and touch my toes, but feet apart, or let's say one staggered stance, so one foot is directly in front of the other. Now I can't. Well, that's not a mobility problem. That's a motor control, or what we call stability problem. So I demonstrated that I can do it, that I can get, that I have access to that mobility. But if you change your foot position, or like you said, you create a different environment, then your brain's going to change what it does. And maybe in that position, you can't access that. So it's not a mobility problem in that case. It is a motor control problem in that case, because your brain is just, you change your environment, and your environment can be kind of what position you put your body in. So it's just that way of thinking, that if I can do it in this position, but I can in this position, that's why we say, okay, if you do an overhead squat, I know the overhead squat is like the test everybody looks at, and say I can squat down and all look good, but when I get into a lunge position, I can't. Well, I've ruled out that it's a hip mobility problem, because if you can squat pretty well in a squat pattern, but you can't lunge, well, then I know it's not a mobility problem in the hips. It may be a motor control problem somewhere. So it's that type of logic, looking at different patterns, not just zeroing in on one. But if you give me a lot of different patterns, then we can say, hey, this is more likely a motor control problem.
Yeah, I hear that.
Problem.
I totally hear that. I mean, there's a time where we need to take a wide angle lens and a microscope, but you have to know how to adjust that lens at just the right time based on what you're seeing. So really, you have to know how the body moves, period. And you have to know what every articulation does. For me, I use gaits because it's one of the most universal ways of moving. And once you know what every joint should do at every phase of gait, then that gives you a map from which you can work on. And then you start watching, like you say, you watch somebody move or do a particular movement, and I should see the hip and the pelvis do this while the knee's doing that, and the head should be in that position. If I start to see that rule be broken, that gives me a starting point, right? Just the same as you have both feet together or in a staggered stance, they do the same movement. Now you've got something to work with. And here's the other thing, and I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but we had this corrective kind of, I won't say exodus, but like this push where suddenly the workouts turned into everyone trying to correct everything else, when we kind of lost sight where we just want people to move with more efficiency. And that means they need to move well. In order to do that, they need to move often, but they need to move in certain ways. And can we encourage it? Either driving them deeper into where they already go to stimulate a stretch, shortening reflex in the soft tissue, or driving them to a place where they don't know how to get there. And then now we're starting to train a little bit more of the structural approach, or maybe we get them into a place where now the muscles are learning something completely different. So I love the RNT approach, but with that whole corrective push, what I guess, what was that like for you guys? Because they took the tank of Kool-Aid and they just doused themselves with it instead of a sip.
Back when we first started this process, it was never about corrective exercise. When we go back, and again, and I say this over and over, and listen, my career has been based off of corrective exercise, quite honestly. But we weren't about corrective exercise. So picture this. Our goal was to take a group of football players, high school level football players, screen these kids through these 7 different movements, and identify which of these movements that they have pain in or that they just can't do. Okay. Now you and I both consider and debate whether the movements are right or wrong, whatever. That's fine. But if it hurts them to do it, the last thing I want them to do is to go in the weight room and do that with load. That was it. That was the premise of this whole thing, was for me to go and screen these 100 football players and say, all right, coach, whether it's at this point it's the high school coach, saying, hey, this kid has a lot of problems and it hurts his knee when he squats with his body weight. And by the way, when he does his shoulder mobility is really, really bad. So let's avoid loaded squats and let's avoid overhead presses or bench press. Hey, the kid can't even do a push-up. Let's avoid those things. It was never about saying you got to do these corrective exercises to fix the problem. But lo and behold, what we stumbled upon is, like the coach would say, and we would sit around the table in the kitchen at this little clinic and say, all right, if we tell the coach they can't squat, 1, they're going to kick me out of the weight room. And 2, they got to squat in order to create strength. So squatting is not bad. It's bad if you can't do it. So we're like, all right, we got to come up with some exercises that can fix these problems once we've identified them. But the primary goal is not prescribing correctives, but that's the number one question we always get. And at this point, Rocky, it shouldn't be about corrective exercise. It should be, here's the best workout I can give you to help you accomplish your goals, period.
Yeah. I keep smiling every time I think about it, that this originated from some basic fundamental lifts in a weight room for a high school team. And were they ready to attempt those lifts? This was not about helping somebody with a scoliotic shift or a frozen shoulder or anything of that nature. This was something that was just put out there as a starting point to start to kind of look at how we design programs in a completely different way, not just based on their 1RM and then creating a periodized program based on how much they can exert force, gross power, or whatever. It's like, well, can we improve upon their mechanics, or and not so much that can we give them a safe environment to lift that hopefully will improve upon their mechanics and carry over onto the playing field. So,
And to be honest, Rocky, when we were talking about it, when we started gaining some traction and we started presenting at the NSCA, and NSCA is one of the first places we presented this idea. And it was at that point, it was literally an idea. Here's something we're doing. We started getting the word out, and we started saying the word injury. Hey, we're trying to prevent injuries. We're trying to be proactive in our approach. And people took that as that we were trying to predict who was going to get hurt. All we were saying is, listen, if a kid has pain in his knee when he squats with his body weight, he's going to get hurt in the weight room. I'm not worried about his football playing. If he's got to play football. So that kind of got all twisted up. And again, we were part to blame because we were throwing that out there. But also on top of that, Rocky, if you think, framing that up, I still believe that's why we gained so much traction in professional sports before we gained a lot of traction anywhere else. Because if you take a professional athlete coming out of a big time, let's say a Division I university, they're already strong. They already have plenty of power. Now it's about keeping it and maintaining it. And to me, that's where when these started doing the movement screen at the professional level, they started saying, okay, these guys have some issues, have some pain. Let's get them moving a little bit better and not so much focus on trying to get them stronger. Hell, these guys are plenty strong at that level. And whatever professional sport, they're there. Now we got to keep them there. And I think that's one, and again, this is my opinion, just looking back on it. And the same thing, one of the first places we started, again, saw a lot of positive impacts was the elite special forces. And the same thing, these guys were just broken during their training, and they just had to start thinking about training differently. And it's not, again, at that point, it was all about how much can you lift, the 1RM, how much can you lift, how fast can you run, how much can you throw. Well, these guys at that level already had plenty of that. They just had to figure out how to maintain it.
All right, so that's great because that's kind of something that I keep bumping up against within the industry, because we have equated strength to these global gross heavy lifts, right? When you think about strength training, we're thinking about the squat and the deadlift and the bench press and all the other major global lifts, which is all well and good if you have those patterns you need to be strong for. But the body respects and relies on specificity of movement. So if you want to be a power lifter, then have at it with the squat, the deadlift, and the bench press. But in regards to special forces, or I train the local firefighters here, yeah, those are great fundamental movements that you probably want to do from time to time in the gym and condition those movements. But that's not necessarily going to help you lift, turn, and get that 40-pound hose line off the rig, or your flak vest, getting it up off the ground and throwing it up onto you. There's specific movements that we have kind of just put off to the side. And I say we as an industry think that there's going to be some trickle down effect just because we're doing these global big lifts. But really,
that's a great point. Yep, that's a great point, Rocky. And the other piece is there's just a minimum level, right? There's just a minimum level of what we say movement competency that you need. Then you want to throw all the strength and power. And as you say, some of these individuals don't need a lot of, they just need a certain amount. And let's just make sure we keep that certain amount and don't try to overtrain them. But when if we're talking about movement, there's just a minimum level you need. And once you get that minimum level, just keep it and now throw everything you want to at it.
Yeah. And okay, so with that too, with this generation compared to say, the recruits with special forces, they were about the same age you were at Appalachian State or when you're starting your master's, which was in 1992 to 94, somewhere in that. We're talking 20 years ago, Lee. And that means that you didn't have cell phones, you didn't have laptops, you were working off a schedule on a spiral binder or something like that.
Yeah, you're
There
going to
was,
the library and using the old Dewey Decimal System to find
yeah,
your
the
research
card catalog
abstract.
was there, everything.
Yeah.
That meant that we were structurally from if we could think of where we are on a spectrum of structural integrity, where we had mobility and stability, and we can talk about all that. Today's individuals are coming at a lower level just due to the technological advances and the reduction of time saving, labor saving, kind of like all those devices reducing our movement. So where is the adjustment in our world, in our industry, to start to create programs to address those populations? You know what I'm saying? Like, we're still building programs in our industry, in the big health clubs, based on something 30 or 40 years ago, where that generation was at a much more sound place to start from.
Yeah, I mean, that's it's a great point, great thing to discuss, because I still say, as much knowledge as we all have and as much research and things that, we read and we have these conversations like we're having, we're still not being that successful. I mean, if you just look at the data of people that are injured, musculoskeletal health, the number one cost right now for insurance companies is orthopedic problems. People are getting knee replacements, and a lot of that is due to knee replacements, hip replacements sooner than they need to.
Yeah.
So I think overall, I mean, you could always zero down and say, okay, the fitness world or strength conditioning world, there's people in there's populations that are really healthy, they're really fit, but overall, we're not doing a very good job.
No.
And honestly, I'll get on my soapbox here for a second, Rocky.
Do it. I want to hear it.
I think again, you get back to physical education. There's no physical education in schools. I mean, it's kind of being pushed to the side, and the physical education that is taught by someone who doesn't understand the physical part. It's taught by, somebody who just wants to roll a ball out there and say, let's go play basketball or go play dodgeball, and not go to the fundamentals of physical education to say, okay, we've got to learn how to skip. I mean, I shot a video with some kids 2 weeks ago. They didn't know how to skip. And these are 10, 12-year-old kids. Didn't know how to skip. So skipping and just just the basics of understanding how to do certain things are getting pushed to the side. Now, here's where I'm getting my soapbox. So that's a problem. But I think now I feel, but my opinion, that's what I'm throwing out here right today, Rocky, right? My opinion is that because it's costing so much money, because we've got to a point that insurance is basically spending all their money on musculoskeletal orthopedic problems, that the light is going to be shown, say, okay, everybody's starting, because with insurance companies are paying for it, it's coming out of our pocket. The insurance companies aren't losing money. They're making money on this deal. But now I think the government and just industries are going to start really looking at, all right, how do we really combat this issue of musculoskeletal health and the fact that the number one reason people miss work is low back pain. So I think it's well beyond, what you and I really zero in, and that's strength conditioning and doing that sort of thing. But I think now we're at a tipping point where, exercise is one of the major contributors to, problems. Physical inactivity is a major issue for chronic conditions. Rocky, we've known this for years and years, but I think really right now, because it's getting in our wallets, people are going to start to pay attention.
Yeah. Honestly, I think it's like taking the dusty Yugo out of the barn that's been sitting there for quite a while, not getting any usage, and throwing a Formula One race car engine under the hood and expecting some great things to occur. That's what's going on in our society when you're talking about high intensity interval training and all the redlining, extreme kind of workouts with bodies that are just not able to handle it. Maybe in the short run, it can do a few laps and wow the crowd every now and then, but ultimately that chassis is not going to withstand the G-forces that engine's trying to create. And there's going to be a lot of bad things happening, and orthopedic issues definitely on the rise. So this brings us all back to mobility stability, because we used to really be heavy with the strength and a little bit quiet with the conditioning. We're strength and conditioning specialists. We got to flip that around. We actually need to be more of the conditioning, maybe movement and conditioning specialists, and drop the strength off to the side, because the more we try to load up the body, the weaker it's actually going to become. And where we've got that arthrokinetic reflex in our bodies, that as soon as we create space, the proper amount of space in a joint, and let it move the way it's supposed to, the autonomic nervous system lights up and says, oh, well, we can generate more force. So you are a great example. I've seen Gray do it myself, that you get somebody to suddenly get in the right position with the proper amount of mobility and the proper amount of motor control, and instantly their strength increases. So why the heck are we spending 6 to 8 weeks in a hypertrophy phase trying to gain fiber size when we should be looking at the nervous system and joint mechanics to improve our strength? I think that's where you and Gray, I'm going to put it to you, because your mouths are much more bigger than mine in terms of the audience. That's where I think that's where we need to go. And I'll get off my soapbox and let you talk about it.
No, you're spot on. And I think that's, because most people you go into a gym and take your firefighters, they want to be strong. You take the 25-year-old firefighter, they want to go in there and they want to lift heavy and they want to do that, and they're going to plateau. They're going to get to the point where they plateau, and manipulating the neurological system, like you said, giving a little bit of more mobility, juicing up the neurological system is what's going to allow them to add a little bit more strength. Because when they get to that hypertrophy, they are kind of tightening up the joints, and giving them a little bit of mobility, giving them a little bit of motor control is what's going to allow them to realign the joint and allow them to juice up the strength without, the 6 to 8 weeks it takes maybe to do it. And it can happen pretty quick if you get the right alignment. But yeah, I mean, I think it's going to, like I said, I think it's at a tipping point where people are going to start to understand the problem. Going back to that 12-year-old who couldn't even skip, that's what's coming up. These kids who haven't, and that's what we're seeing with some of the data we're seeing is a lot of these people who are coming up and entering the workforce, going into the gym. There's been, a pretty significant increase in exercise-related injuries over a 10-year span, because, in my opinion, they didn't have that foundation coming up, whether it's through physical education or they were playing one sport year round. They weren't, cross-training enough. And then they go in the weight room and they try to just lift heavy. And it's just setting them up for problems if they don't get that good foundation first.
Yeah, and added to that, the endorphin rush or the adrenaline that somebody gets from that kind of lifting and stressing the system is a high that you want to covet and repeat. So by actually providing them what their body needs, they do get a bit of that. It's just not they're breathing heavy, they're not sweating as profusely as much, but it's hard to recognize. Like when you were at Appalachian State and you had everything there with those professors, and it wasn't until afterwards that you realized, oh man, I had that right there. It's the same thing, that providing these people with really what they need, not what they're expecting or not what they're envisioning that should happen, but actually having them do these kind of particular programs that will improve their mobility, that will enhance their stability, and they walk out feeling like, okay, that was good, but now I want to go do something. That is the barometer for me. That is my litmus test. Like when the clients walk out of here, I don't want them going and laying down and taking a nap, because I don't want that kind of outcome. I want them to go, okay, that was good. I think I'm going to go mountain biking right now. Or, oh, yeah. I think I'm going to go away for the weekend. I've always wanted to climb that mountain. Like, you have just unlocked so much movement potential, and their brain is going, now let's use it. That is really where we want to go with our clients, and with the kids for that matter too.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, if we give them the foundation, give them again, like you said, I think you said maybe opportunity or movement opportunities, then they can go out and do the hiking, do the cycling. And let's be honest, like, we're in strength conditioning area. There's nothing wrong with getting in there and lifting heavy. And there's nothing wrong with deadlifting heavy. And, but there's a point where you still have to maintain the good fundamentals, the good kind of chassis under the engine, making sure the brakes are good and just make sure all the air is in the tires if you're going to add horsepower. And there's nothing wrong with adding horsepower. We just got to make sure we got those fundamentals of what we're talking about, mobility and stability.
Yeah, we got to meet the people where they are, and through an educational process, perhaps, and kind of enriching their understanding of what their body is all about. Will they start to come and see that, okay, yeah, I am going to do some lifts. I definitely want to do that, but I know that I have to take responsibility for this part of it to get me ready to be in the position to do such things, because I'm just not going to come in with what I'm walking in with now, a deconditioned frame, and expect to perform at powerlifting levels. We just got to, yeah, slowly progress them on there. So,
Yep.
man, Lee, this has been great. I could talk, as you can tell, I can chat with you back and forth for a long time to come, and I don't think we'd run out of topics or interest by any stretch. But I want to just spend a couple of minutes just talking about, the FMS and what you've got going on there. How's your writing coming along? Got any more books coming out?
I've been poking Gray for about 3 years trying to get our second edition of Movement out, and he's working on it. We've got a few things in the hopper. We got some stuff coming out. The goal for 2022 is to have some pretty neat stuff out. I think the big thing for us is kind of going on this whole musculoskeletal health thing, looking at, all the other factors that we need to be considering if we really want to create a more healthy individual. Strength's part of that, mobility, stability is part of that, but also some of these other lifestyle issues. And we've got the one thing we've got going for us, Rocky, is we've got 20 some years of data and 20 some years of, research and information. And we've got some pretty neat things that can put you in certain categories based off of how you do. And I don't want to say injury risk. We just want to categorize as more musculoskeletal health. The one thing that we do have is based off the research and evidence is if you do some of the tests we have, we can determine your injury risk. And we look at that more as a return to play thing. That's Y balance testing and something called mood to perform. But we're trying to put that more, because, one of the things we've gotten over the years is the FMS is too difficult for some people. So we've been working on some stuff pretty much since 2017. So it's been 4 years in the works. Because we're a little bit older now, Rocky. We can't just throw something out on the table. We might get in trouble. So we've been working on a couple things that the goals for, January 2022, we start pushing it out that, it's not just about movement screening, not just about corrective exercise, but kind of giving you a little bit better perspective on sleep, nutrition, hydration, and taking some of those factors and putting it together.
I'm glad you bring all those up, including the fact that the FMS reminding listening audience that it was meant for high school athletes. It was not meant for a 62-year-old deconditioned individual looking to start personal training. There's plenty of other movements to assess. And again, if you know how joints move and how they have a relationship with one another, and you can observe that, then that's a great place to start. I just want to say thanks for coming on. And for people that are interested in more with Lee, then you got to tune in Thursday. That'll be August 19th, performbetter.com. That's 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 p.m. Eastern time. Lee, Sue Falzoni, we've got Frank Dolan and Michelle Dalcour. The four of you are going to be having a meeting of the minds when it comes to mobility, stability. And fortunately, I'll have some time on my hands to tune in and listen to. So thanks for being here, Lee. I really appreciate it.
No, Rocky, thanks for the opportunity. I always having these types of conversations. Anytime you want to have me back, I'll be more than happy to come on. And, this was great.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Zealous Podcast. Hope you enjoyed Lee and our conversation. I certainly did. And be sure to tune in next week. We have another amazing guest. And in the meantime, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead, hit the button. Just subscribe and tell a friend or 20. That would be great. Have a great week.